guys, so I am here to do what I always feel like is the most exciting video of the entire year. I know it's the video I look forward to the most in my subscription box every year, and that's my best books of 2019. As always, these are books that I read in 2019, not necessarily books that came out in 2019, but they are all books I absolutely adored for one reason or another that I would highly recommend to the vast majority of you. I know not every book is for every person, but I would love to see in the hands of more people and would love to talk about it with more people. Plus a few I'm sure I myself will end up rereading in the near future. So you know what to expect by now with these videos, and I have a lot of books to talk to you about, so I'm going to jump straight in. I did actually read over 140 books for recreation and work this year, so there was a lot to pick from. But I am planning on doing a separate video all about my different reading stats and kind of reflecting back on my year in reading, so look out for that if you're interested. But in no particular order, I'm looking at the books here trying to decide where to start because they're all fabulous. I think I will go with the one that catches my eye first, and that is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. I think the same will apply for a lot of these books, but you've heard me talk about this book if you've been watching most of my videos throughout the year, because I've definitely talked about it multiple times. This is a book told over two time periods, one a more contemporary time period and one set, I would say, like more historical but still within the 1900s, so you know, not exactly ancient history. But it follows a biographer, or an amateur biographer, a woman who was raised by her father who owns an antiquarian bookshop, and in her free time writes biographies of people she finds interesting, not necessarily the most famous people of all time, until she gets a letter from this incredibly well-known, well-respected, well-loved female author asking her to be her biographer. That's of hers. But this author has basically never really told the true story of her life. Every time she's ever given an interview, she's given a different account of who she is, where she comes from, and everyone's super curious because she has this massive back catalogue of books that people absolutely adore. And our other protagonist, the biographer, takes on this job and then goes to visit this author, and it's about piecing together the story of her life and the other people that she grew up with as a child in this kind of strange, secluded, mysterious household, quite well off, like genteel background, where there were lots of secrets and quite dark secrets at play, and it's those two time periods between the biographer finding everything out and the actual story of our author, and actually the story of the generation before her as well, because that plays a big role in who she is. So in part this is a book about books, it's a book about writing, it's a book about pouring yourself into your writing and the experience of the reader. It's also a fascinating mystery. I was so compelled and intrigued all the way through. Diane Setterfield gave me the perfect amount as a reader to keep me hooked and intrigued and feel like something new was constantly being introduced to storyline, but never feeling like any of it was obvious. And I constantly felt like there was a new mystery arising almost with every chapter, whilst one kind of secret came to close and I understood what was going on there was something else to be curious about, and that was such a wonderful reading experience for me, that complete captivation and consistent pacing. I also think it is absolutely beautifully written. I think in large part it's Diane Setterfield's mastery of the craft of writing that makes this such a compelling narrative, but it's also just beautiful to read in that way that each paragraph painted such a vivid picture of both the setting, the history, but also the characters. I felt like this was a character study of both the biographer and the author, and even though this was a short period in both of their lives and quite near the end of the author's career anyway, it still felt like I saw a lot of growth in their journeys and their stories, and it was so wonderful to see that. They felt very, very real to me as a reader. Next up is a genre of books that there always has to be at least one of in these videos, and that's 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes, which is a retelling of an instance in Greek mythology, specifically the Trojan War. So this book is inspired by an event that has been covered time and time again in ancient literature, in like basically any period of literature since antiquity. It's an instance in mythology and partially history that has fascinated people for centuries, millennia in fact. Yet this book in itself still manages to be incredibly unique, because what it does is it gives us the female perspectives, and as far as it can, all of the female perspectives. So what Natalie Haynes' book does is it flits between different periods in the war. It's not chronological, so we'll jump from the beginning of the war, sort of the events that led up to it, we'll jump to kind of the late days of the war, after the war, the early days of the war, and piece together an experience of an entire section of the populace who's often ignored in these ancient war narratives. And what I loved about this book is that no voice is more important than the other. Some women who we know from the myth are very, very briefly mentioned, say, in some of the original texts, like Homer's Iliad. Like, we barely know anything about them, but they still get a chapter in this book that with Natalie Haynes building on that little bit of information we do know and kind of speculating how they might have felt, how they might have reacted, how this war might have affected them. Then on the other hand, we hear from women like Penelope, who are more central and are talked about more often, but aren't necessarily given the same opportunity to have their voices heard and their perspectives heard. And we also hear from goddesses, so it's not just mortal women, it's also lesser and more major goddesses who are slightly apart from the action. They're not affected in the same way if they're, say, one of the Olympians, because in a way they're part of the group who are manipulating these events, but then some of the other goddesses or more minor goddesses have been impacted because their lives regularly interact with the humans, and I just loved that kind of attention to detail, that we got the voices of so many different women who all had different experiences, different interpretations of these events, and really considering how that war, both in the mythological and historical sense, might have affected them. And it's so masterfully done. You think that it might be quite jarring to read so many perspectives or to jump around in time so often, but it's not. It's like this beautiful puzzle of emotions and thoughts and feelings that just pieces together absolutely perfectly by the end and is a pleasure to read and equally beautifully written. This was Natalie Haynes' second myth retelling, and although I really enjoyed the other one, I think she just gets better and better, and I can't wait to see what she does if she retells another myth, because each time she does something new. And I will actually mention that I do have an interview with the author on my podcast, so I'll link that down below if you'd like to hear more from Natalie Haynes herself about writing the book and what went into it, because it's absolutely fascinating in itself. Next up is Sealed by Naomi Booth. This is a literary, apocalyptic, epidemic horror novel that absolutely blew me away. Like, I could not put this book down. I think I read it in 1 or 2 days, which is not something I do often, even if I'm loving a book, but certain, I think, plots and narratives and writing styles mean it's almost impossible to put a book down, and that's what I felt with this book. And I also haven't stopped thinking about it since. It really stuck in my mind in the immediate aftermath as quite horrific, but in a way that it was meant to be, and it was very effective in what it did. But I've also thought about it a lot more, but I've also continued to think about it even as I've grown more distant from it and less traumatised by it. I think that's my experience generally with kind of literary horror, is that it seeps a little bit into my nightmares, but it's worth it in the long run, if that makes sense. This story follows a woman in a near future where a new disease has started to spread the world, and it is causing people's skin to seal over. So it might seal over their mouth, their nose, their ears, etc, etc, and that can lead to death if, say, their nose and mouths are sealed over and they can't breathe anymore. But if you can't afford them, you can't get them, so you might die regardless. Not that too unimaginable. And amidst this changing world that is also being affected by pollution and global warming, our protagonist has found herself pregnant. She's recently lost her mother, found herself pregnant from an on and off again relationship that she isn't currently in, but has re-entered into because of the pregnancy. They've decided to kind of give it like this final shot as grown adults who have a baby on the way, but all of this she has such mixed feelings for. So much has changed in her life in such a short period of time. None of it she was expecting or necessarily wanting. The pregnancy was unforeseen, and although she's decided to keep the baby, she has very mixed feelings about the whole experience, and her own body is changing whilst the world is changing, and there's this interconnect between the spreading of this disease, the changing world around her, her relationships, the loss of her mother, and this life that's growing inside her and her kind of detachment to that life. And it affects her both physically and mentally, and she becomes obsessed with this disease. She's convinced that the governments know more about it than they're telling them, and that it's worse than people think out there, you know, in the everyday world. And you as a reader have to balance what is her paranoia and what is perfectly reasonable fear. And as the book goes on, you learn that although she's becoming obsessed, she may be onto something. And it's so well done. Like I said, I could not put this down. I thought it was beautifully written. Again, such vivid imagery always, and it really just captured my imagination. It made me think about a lot of different topics. It's not a very long book, but it muses on a lot of different subjects and quite raw emotional subjects, and it was so well done. The next two books on my list are both middle grade, so I will mention those together. And the first one is the sequel, and that is Wondersmith by Jessica Townsend. This is book 2 in the Trials of Morrigan Crow, the first book of which was Nevermore, and the first book in the series got so much hype. Not to say the second book hasn't had lots of hype as well, but I'm sure a lot of you have heard of book 1, and if you haven't yet read it, I would urge you to give it a shot. Even if you're not terribly certain about middle grade as an adult, this is the kind of book that might change your mind. This is the kind of series that might change your mind. And I just felt like Wondersmith completely built on all of the wonderful things that Jessica Townsend set up in book 1, and delivered an equally engaging, mesmerising adventure with some real moments of darkness. What I found so interesting about Wondersmith is that it is light in parts. It does have all the fun and excitement of a children's book, but it doesn't shy away from kind of upping the stakes and making you really feel like the characters are in danger, because maybe they are, and painting a world that isn't perfect and that there is kind of evil around every corner potentially. And I thought that that was really well done, because I enjoyed reading that as an adult, but I definitely think it's something children can handle. I think this is a book that is just a genuinely good book regardless of its age demographic. I think with any book, whether it's children's, YA, adults, first and foremost it's writing for its age bracket, because that audience is as deserving of a book specifically aimed at them as anybody else, and this book does that, but it also manages to push beyond that and kind of bring other ages along with it, which is wonderful for me as an adult reader, because it means I get to continue enjoying books like Wondersmith, which are aimed at children. If you don't know, Nevermore book 1 follows Morrigan Crow, a young girl of 11 years old who is cursed to die on her birthday, but instead of dying is rescued by a man called Jupiter North, who comes from another kind of world or city called Nevermore that she's never been to, that's kind of cut off from her own city, which is very different, and taken to compete in the trials to enter into the Wondrous Society, which is a society in Nevermore that takes on young people with special gifts. However, Morrigan doesn't know what her special gift is. She can't quite believe that she even has a special gift, and obviously that aspect of her personality is kind of uncovered in book 1, and we see her development as a character in book 2, the new relationships she builds with others around her, the way she's treated because of the gift that she has, and kind of how she and her peers learn to accept one another, as well as all these dark dramatic things I mentioned earlier, but I don't want to give away because it is a sequel. However, I would highly recommend, if you enjoyed book 1, get on with book 2, give it a shot, and if you haven't tried the series, equally check it out. My next middle grade read is actually a standalone though, and that is Bloom by Nicholas Skinner. This is actually a debut middle grade novel, and if the debut is this good, I cannot wait for whatever Nicholas Skinner writes next, and I will be continuing to read everything she publishes, regardless of whether it's for children or not, because this is just some good writing and some good fiction. I think this book had a lot of what I look for in a middle grade. I thought it had a sense of humour that I very much appreciated. I thought it managed to be both fun, light, gruesome and serious all at the same time. It explored a very important issue, which is very much kind of the loss of green spaces and the impact of that on climate change, through a kind of magic realism, fun, exciting adventure about two girls living in this little town. We follow a little girl called Sorrel, who is raised by a single mother and takes life very seriously. She takes a lot upon herself. She feels as if she has to make her mother happy, and one of the themes of the story is very much exploring the lack of communication between mother and child and kind of how they break that down and learn to communicate throughout the story. But equally, Sorrel takes school very seriously. She always does really well. She is sort of like favourite student of all teachers and the headmaster. She follows all the rules. However, she has to start questioning some of those rules in this book when their playground is about to get cemented over, and her best friend objects to this and decides to start causing trouble, starting a petition and sort of sticking up for what she believes in despite the potential threat of expulsion. And Sorrel has to kind of navigate her loyalties to her friend and what she thinks is right, and perhaps how maybe what adults tell her is right isn't always right. And amidst all of these themes, she finds a pack of magical seeds that lead her down an adventure in self-exploration, exploration of her relationships to others and her world around her, and kind of what is right and what is wrong, and the future of her little town. Again, obviously I don't want to say any more than that because I don't want to spoil anything, but this book is so much fun. It's such a rip-roaring adventure while still dealing with very real subjects, and I thought it was really, really magical. I think that leads nicely on to the only young adult book that has made it onto this list, but I think it deserves to be there, obviously, and that is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Brigid Kemmerer. I picked this book up because it had been compared to The Cruel Prince on Goodreads, and I'd heard good things about it. It was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which I quite enjoy, but I wasn't expecting it to stick with me as much as it has since I've read it. I really don't think I expected the impact it would have, because although I do expect to enjoy to some degree everything I pick up, I don't necessarily expect them all to have a massive impact on me or to make it to my best books of the year, but this one has, so that was wonderful. This book is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, like I mentioned. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling which takes a young girl, a teenage girl from our modern world and flings her into this magical parallel universe where the kind of Beauty and the Beast narrative is taking place. We have a prince who has had a curse placed on him, and we also have his kind of manservant and companion, and we get to know all three characters. And actually book 2, from what I'm aware, I haven't read it yet, actually follows the manservant more than it follows the prince and young woman from book 1. So they are all characters that are due and will receive their kind of full development, and that's wonderful because I thought they were all really interesting young people. Especially Harper, our out of time, out of place young woman who, whilst being in an unforeseen and unwanted circumstance in this magical world where there's curses and princes and political intrigues and sorceresses and commoners in danger, she also gets an opportunity to prove herself and prove her independence, and she is such an endearing young woman. I loved Harper. I thought she really was a complex young woman, going through a lot of stuff. Her mum is terminally ill. Her older brothers got caught up with some bad people in order to pay off their dad's debts, who ran away and abandoned them, and she also has cerebral palsy, which is actually one of the reasons that her own brother doesn't really allow her the opportunity to help their family. But more than anything else, that's what Harper wants to do. She's such a kind, giving person, and she wants to help. And she wants to help these people that she hasn't even known for very long and she's been dragged into this other world of. And we see her developing a relationship with both the manservant and the prince, who she forms bonds with, and it is a really clever retelling of Beauty and the Beast, I felt. It has a lot of the elements I think people enjoy about that story, and it's why people continue to retell that story, but I also think it was very much its own unique story, which is wonderful. I of course don't have cerebral palsy, so can't speak to the representation as somebody who sees themselves in the book. I personally thought it was incredible to see a main character in a young adult fantasy novel with a disability. So I really enjoyed that, but if you yourself have cerebral palsy and have read the book and have any thoughts, I would really love to hear them if you want to share them. But after having read this book, I would like to see more books like this, so it had to be on this list. I think this means we should continue on our fantasy journey though, and I do actually have another Beauty and the Beast retelling on this list, so why not tick it off now? And that is Entreat Me by Grace Draven. I had to mention something by Grace Draven on this list because I read my first book by her last year but have continued to read numerous books by her throughout the rest of this year, including a reread of that first book, which was Radiance, but I can't mention that here because I read it for the first time in 2018, so Entreat Me is making the cut. I did love this book. This is another Beauty and the Beast retelling, which is wonderful and unique and compelling in its own ways. It is an adult fantasy novel, and the romance in it is very much a central part of it. Grace Draven's fantasy books are very much, you know, sort of equal parts fantasy and equal parts romance, which is something I love about them. And I always think she makes the most interesting pairings and really explores the development between the two characters that she is showing falling in love throughout the stories, and developing that relationship between one another. I think she always does a really good in-depth job of exploring that, and I need that in a romance. It needs to feel believable, and I need to understand both the characters and who they are separately and together. And I really enjoyed this retelling because both our Beauty and the Beast characters, you know, the central romance pair, are a little bit older. They're in their 30s or 40s. One's a widow, one's a widower. So this isn't like their first love or their first relationship or their first time with another person. This is two people kind of finding each other at the right time in their life amidst quite a messy magical scenario, because this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And there's actually another pair that kind of compete for the Beauty and the Beast role, so this is why it's not necessarily obvious that although they're the main romance, they're the Beauty and the Beast characters, because our older woman's younger sister, who you might normally expect to be the central character, has run away with this young rich man who she's fallen in love with, and her sister trudges after her to take her home, because even if they're in love, they are certainly not going to spend weeks together alone and unmarried in his castle, because that would ruin her reputation. And when she gets there, she meets this young man's father, and that's the man that she has a relationship with, and she's also kind of chaperoning her younger sibling with this young man. But of course this is Beauty and the Beast, so there's something darker afoot. There is a curse on this castle, and it's just an absolutely fabulous novel, and I adored it. I adored all the characters, loved my central female character, which is so important to me in any novel. I thought she was so interesting, so complex, and I loved her banter with the male lead. They had such good banter with one another, and it was fun to read. But then let's talk about a queer fantasy romance, and that is The Queen of Afluria by Effie Calvin. This book cemented Effie Calvin as a new favourite author for me, and it's funny because I've had other friends read it since, and they've just said the exact same thing. It was a short novel, it was less than 200 pages, although there's 2 sequels already out, so you know you've got a good chunk of fiction there to get your teeth into. But it manages to really get inside your heart in those few pages. The characters like burrow in there deep, and you fall in love with all of them. And I say all of them because in book 2 we actually follow a different set of central characters before returning to the original 2 female protagonists in book 3, and we're just getting to know more about this world and all the different people in it. And one of the best things about this fantasy world is its complete acceptance of the LGBTQ+ spectrum. There is like non-binary representation. There's discussions of people like transitioning from male to female and female to male, although none of the central characters are like trans or non-binary, but they're there. And equally all queer relationships and sexualities are embraced, and both couples in the 3 books I've read by Effie Calvin are women falling in love with women, and I absolutely love that. In book 1 we actually follow an arranged marriage between 2 princesses, which I've literally never read before. How many times have you read a book about an arranged marriage in a fantasy historical setting? When is it ever between 2 people of the same sex? Never, never, not enough. And I got that in this book. The arranged marriage itself is set up to form an alliance between 2 kingdoms, one of whom has the ability to offer magic that can defeat these dragons that are attacking the other kingdom. So that's kind of why this is taking place. So we get these sort of action, adventure, political background of different kingdoms and their relationships, and a city at threat. But we also get to know 2 wonderful, unique young women who are very different but bring out the best in each other and grow alongside one another, and just are able to build a really beautiful relationship out of something that has been arranged for convenience of like, obviously, like I mentioned, kind of like political alliances. And it's so nice to see, and it's just such a beautiful fantasy world. There's a lot of complex, like, political systems, religious systems. There's various different gods and goddesses who come into play even more so in book 2. And I always enjoy a kind of like polytheistic religious system in fiction. I think that's just because of my fascination with Greek mythology. But I thought that was really well done as well. All of it was just completely dazzling, and I just couldn't believe how quickly it had me on board in so few pages, and I cannot wait for more in this series and in this world and about these different women. And book 2 in this series is just as good, if not better. I was dubious about reading a sequel to a book where it had different protagonists when I'd fallen in love so much with the protagonist in book 1, but it just introduced me to 2 more wonderful women that I fell in love with, and a relationship that I completely believed and enjoyed seeing the development of, so would highly recommend. As always, I think this video is going to be 500 years long. But next up for fantasy, last for fantasy actually, is Harp of Kings by Juliet Marillier. Now, I toyed between which Juliet Marillier to put in this video because of course one was going to make the cut. And the other book that I gave 5 stars by Juliet Marillier and did absolutely adore and considered mentioning was the 3rd book in the Blackthorn and Grimm series, but since it's the last book in a trilogy, whereas Harp of Kings is the 1st book in a new series, I thought I would concentrate on that. So Harp of Kings actually builds on some of the world and setup that we see developed in the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy, which is so wonderful for me because I love those books, and it was kind of nice learning a little bit about what happened to those characters after those books. But you can read it entirely independently. It's not written in any way as a sequel. It's a new series, and just as great a place to start with Juliet Marillier as anywhere else, to be honest. It is her latest offering to the world of medieval Irish fantasy. It only came out a few months ago, and I buddy read it with my friends this month, December, and it just, you know, it just made that cut. It got in there, and it totally deserves to be in this video. She does it every time, and I don't know how, but Juliet Marillier is one of my favourite fantasy authors, and I've given virtually every book I've read by her 5 stars. She just manages to combine excellent character development, excellent characters who have really interesting relationships, whether those are romantic, familial, friendship, or even enemies. They're all really interesting to follow and all really well done. This book in particular has 3 central characters who narrate their own storyline, and those are Livon, her brother Broch, and their companion Dao. They are all training to be warriors on Swan Island, which is this island that trains warriors. That's basically it. And they've been sent on a mission together along with 2 of the older warriors on the island, more experienced warriors, and this is their first mission together, and they basically have to act as spies. They all have to take on new identities, each being cast in a role that kind of tests their own abilities, and they're there to find the Harp of Kings, which is this harp that was created by the fair folk as part of a sort of like alliance between the fair folk and the humankind hundreds of years ago, and it's played at the coronation of each new king to kind of re-cement that alliance and the respect between those 2 people. However, it seems to be stolen and it's time to coronate a new king, and they don't know where it is, and they think if it's not played at the ceremony then no one will accept the new king. So they have to go on this mission to find the harp. But when they're there, they also have their kind of loyalties tested. They have to decide what is right, what is wrong, is what they've been told to do the best thing to do, and they have to get to know one another better and kind of develop trust with one another, particularly Livon and Dao. I mean, Livon and Broch are brother and sister, so they're already pretty close. But Dao and Livon start off with a bit of an antagonistic relationship, and they really develop a friendship by the end, which I think may very well develop into romance in later books, and I'm here for that, to be honest, and I can't wait to see what's next for them in book 2. It was perfectly paced, there was constantly something happening, but it never felt rushed, and I still felt like she was taking her time to describe the setting and the kind of lush medieval Irish backdrop that I always enjoy of her books, because that's kind of the most common setting of her books. She doesn't always set her books there, but most of the time she does, and I really enjoy that. And I just love this book as much as I've loved her other books. I'm glad to say she's continuing to kind of pump out excellent literature, and if you're looking for somewhere to start, then this might be a good place to do that. But since I've talked a little bit about romance during some of these fantasy book reviews, I'm going to now focus on a romance novel, a historical romance novel. it was very difficult. I don't think I really have one particular favourite to mention to you here, because it's basically just an opportunity to say how much I love Tessa Dare and how all of her historical Regency romance books are brilliant and you should read them all. But I'm going to focus on one here, and that is A Night to Surrender. Specifically because this is book 1 in the Spindle Cove series, which is one of the best backdrops for a Regency romance series I have ever read, but I haven't read that many, but I still love the concept, because Spindle Cove is this small seaside town where a genteel woman has set up a kind of retreat for other young ladies or older ladies who are not quite what society wants or expects them to be. That might be because they're poets or intellectuals or geologists or just incredibly shy or have had scandal surround them, which means that they're kind of rejected from polite society, and they have this opportunity to kind of really explore who they are as women and as individuals in Spindle Cove in a way that society doesn't necessarily allow them to, because they are women. And I love that backdrop. And then in each book in this series we follow a different woman at Spindle Cove falling in love, but I feel like her romance and her relationship throughout each book never undermines the independence that Spindle Cove offers her, and she always manages to find a man that accepts her for who she is, and they are so much fun to follow. They are so funny. Every book in the series is really funny. In book 1 we actually follow the genteel woman I mentioned earlier who set up basically this community. We learn more about her motivation for doing so, why it matters so much to her, and also get to see her develop and find some self-acceptance in a way she hasn't necessarily done beforehand, as well as find this man that accepts her, and she manages to bring out the best in him while they're at it, so that's lovely. These books are rather smutty, be warned if that's not your thing, but they equally have fantastic characters and interesting plot lines to follow whilst you're getting that fun romantic side of things. And I think, as sort of Regency romances goes, these are pretty feminist, and I'm really looking forward to reading more Tessa Dare in the new year. But that brings me to the end of the fiction section, because all the rest of the books I'm going to talk to you about are non-fiction. Starting with Lowborn by Kerry Hudson. This book is Kerry Hudson's own story. It's her biography in part, but also an exploration of poverty in Britain. She grew up in Torquay, which is a kind of impoverished part of Aberdeenshire here in Scotland, and moved around a lot as a kid with her mother, either living with her mother and her on and off again husband, I believe he was, or just them two, or with her younger sister, or at one point she gets taken into foster care. Her circumstances constantly change, and it's that instability which is a large part of her upbringing and kind of a result of the poverty that she lives in. I mean, not everyone lives in poverty, moves around a lot, or necessarily changes their household so much, but you can see the connections between both of those things and the struggles that she faced as a young person growing up in poverty, and kind of the struggles that those older than her had in taking care of her. And she was sort of commissioned to write this book, and whilst writing this book learns more about her childhood that she'd kind of suppressed or ignored or never really asked questions about. So the book is her journey in writing the book, if that makes sense. So she's very conscious whilst writing this book that she is learning more about herself, and she's very introspective throughout it all, both into her life and both the systems and the issues in our country that result in children living in poverty, and it's horrific and it's only getting worse. I think you can see from the statistics about child poverty and food bank use and malnutrition and everything like that in this country, and it's absolutely horrendous. And I thought it was so heartbreaking, and I thought it was so raw, and it was an incredible thing for Kerry Hudson to write and to do, and I'm really grateful to her for doing that, and I hope it ends up in the hands of so many people. So be one of those people. Please pick this book up. I thought it was incredible. We then have Superior by Angela Saini. This is a book all about the history of race science. So it's looking at how throughout the past few centuries, both scientists and non-scientists have tried to defend the concept of race and sort of segregating and separating people according to skin colour and other physical characteristics and where they're born, and then determine who is better at what, who deserves certain positions in society, and create some sort of hierarchy based on these sort of racial types. And it's fascinating and important, and I am not scientifically minded, I'm not a scientist. It's something I kind of find a little bit daunting reading about, but I think Angela Saini's approach, which is to look at it historically and kind of trace both the science and what people theorised, but then how it was practically imposed on people and used, and the impacts that it had and still has today, was really, really accessible. She writes the most accessible non-fiction books, Angela Saini, but also on really important topics I think are so well researched and so fascinating to read about, if you know, hard hitting. And I think this book is particularly important because it discusses how these theories that are outdated and, you know, were never really grounded in any sort of reality can still threaten to re-emerge now and at any point really in time and be used and manipulated to create hierarchies within society. And I think that's something that we still see, especially amongst like alt-right and white supremacist groups, and it's something we need to be talking about and educating ourselves about. And I felt like I came out of this book with so much more knowledge, which is what you want from a non-fiction book. So I would highly, highly recommend checking it out, and also listening to the audiobook, which is brilliant. Much shorter than the rest of the non-fiction books on this list is Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto. This book is written by 3 different women, and it is all about the importance of considering capitalism and class when considering our feminist politics, how our feminism needs to be intersectional. And I mean, feminism has a history of being kind of dominated by the middle and upper classes, and the conversations often excluding those that have less, when really they're the ones that need feminism the most. And this short book is basically about how we need to retain a class analysis when discussing feminism in the modern world, and that this is the feminism that we need going into the future, which is something I 100% agree with. It's not a new thought experiment, but it's something that often gets overlooked and we need to keep writing about, reading about, and then talking about. So that's why I would, you know, want to include this book here. I thought it was short and accessible and like a good jumping off point to then read more. So do check that one out. Also on the topic of women, I wanted to mention The Women in the Room, which kind of discusses some of those issues actually about kind of the intersections between class and sexism. And as does my next book, because The Women in the Room is all about women's historical involvement in the labour movement, particularly in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Britain. But I would encourage everybody to read it because it's something that, you know, went on everywhere in different ways. And the next book I want to mention actually is more about America. Women in the Room by Nan Sloan is essentially a fascinating piece of political historical non-fiction that looks at the sort of direct action, the political activism, the academic and thought contributions of women in a time period where it's often seen as men were the ones dominating the conversation. I mean, they were dominating the conversation, but that we sort of sometimes overlook the female voices. And equally at a time where sometimes it's thought that the only thing that women were fighting for was suffrage and the vote, when really women were fighting for a lot more than that. I mean, many of them were equally fighting for working class men to have the vote, but also fighting for fairer working conditions, equal treatment, and just sort of respect in every aspect of society. And that's why it's an exploration of women's involvement in the labour movement and really the part they had to play in helping, you know, create organisations in Britain that fought for fair and equal treatment within labour. And it's something that we're still, you know, struggling with, but these women were pioneers and it's fascinating to read about them. And then equally, I think drawing on a similar topic as well as other important intersections of feminism is Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis. Angela Davis is one of my favourite writers of all time. Her non-fiction is incredible. It's so well researched but so accessible, and deals with such important topics. I mean, is this not true of any non-fiction I'm mentioning here? But this book specifically kind of traces the history of, I mean, predominantly black women's lives in America from slavery up until like the civil rights movement in essays covering different topics. But you also learn a lot about kind of the general sort of abolitionist movements, the various stages in different groups gaining the right to vote in the United States, the sort of women's liberation movements, and how, you know, all these different movements in lots of different ways let down black women. They suffered racism, you know, from the women's liberation, and they suffered sexism from the sort of male-dominated abolitionist movements and then civil rights movements. And just looking at the role that black women played in all of that history, and also how it impacted them and their story over a century. Because we start during slavery and what it was like for female slaves in the US. We then follow essays through the abolition of slavery, then really the way in which black men and women were sort of continued to be enslaved by low paid or unpaid work, or the incarceration system, which then rented them out as workers for like minor offences, going on, like I mentioned, into more contemporary times for Angela Davis when she was writing this in the 1970s. And it's a fantastic essay collection. Every essay is really, really interesting by itself, and then as a whole the book makes something so thought-provoking and still so important today. But those are all the books I want to mention in this video. I have been sitting here filming for almost an hour, although I'm sure this video will not end up an hour once I've edited it down. Hopefully not, anyway. But I'm actually going to be late to go and see a friend and give her son some Christmas presents, so I wouldn't want to deprive him of that, and for that reason I'm going to keep things short and sweet. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope you've got some new book recommendations, and please do let me know what your favourite reads were of 2019 in the comments down below, because I need more books to read in 2020. And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!